So now I would like to welcome the one and only Jeff Chang and the panel Code Red, The Ethics of Hip Hop Journalism. Thank you so, so much, everybody, for being here.
Oh, we got theme music. Yeah, if we can get everybody. Oh, here comes Karen. How's everybody doing? What a morning so far. We are just over the moon. I think last night was just exceptional. It was really good to see so many amazing faces last night. It has been like a reunion. It's been kind of ecstatic in a way. It's inspiring. And I'm just so happy to be here. Thank you so much to Dean Cobb, to Elizabeth, to Rashid, to Critical Minded, to the Journalism School here, to the Ford Foundation for hosting us. Yeah, and we're about to get into it here with something about the ethics of hip-hop journalism. I've got an amazing panel here. But just to start, just to say that hip-hop journalism has been so many things for us, right? It's been sort of an enthusiastic kind of forum to be able to hype up the most important arts and cultural movement of our time. It's been a place for us to be able to talk about necessary race reporting in an age where there's been domestic wars on youth. Particularly black youth and youth of color. It's been a place for us to do myth-making under changing social conditions. It's been a place to have arts criticism that's decentered whiteness, that's developed informed audiences for black aesthetics and black cultural politics. And it's been also a place for celebrity journalism, working between the need for truth and representation and also the needs of capital, right? Brown and black capital, but mostly the old white capital. So it's raised a lot of the old questions around journalism that we're so used to, that we hear about in J school, that those of us coming up in journalism are constantly dealing with, but it's also raised some new ones. And this is a discussion that will allow us to really get into some of the third rails of journalism, to talk about the relationship between the artist or the subject, I should say, and the journalist, to talk about the push and pull between the goals of journalism and the economics of journalism. So all of that, we're going to do all of that in about 45 minutes, I think. And we got an amazing panel here. I'm going to introduce them real quick, and then we're just going to jump right into it. Akiba Solomon is the senior editor at the Marshall Project. Yeah, give it up. Go ahead. With former stints at Color Lines, where we were able to work together, and the health editor at Glamour, a researcher for health editor for Essence, excuse me, researcher for Glamour, and the senior editor at Vibe Vixen and at The Source, where she was my editor and taught me so much and was brutal with me. She's an NABJ award-winning journalist from West Philly and the recipient of the 2021 Bart Richards Award for Media Criticism, and she's a co-author of How We Fight White Supremacy, a field guide to black resistance, Akiba Solomon. On the other side, we have Andre G., who's a music and culture writer from Washington, D.C. Get over for Andre. Go ahead. Yeah. He's a staff writer for Rolling Stone. He's written for Complex, Vibe, OK Player, and many others. He writes the More Fire Substack newsletter and is widely regarded as one of the best hip-hop journalists working today. Andre G. To his right, left, right, is Davey D, journalist, professor, hip-hop historian, DJ, media, and community activist from the Bronx. He's a co-founder and host of Hard Knock Radio, an award-winning daily syndicated primetime afternoon show focusing on hip-hop culture and politics on KPFA in the Bay, and heard across the country, reaching nearly 1 million listeners daily. He's also the founder of Davey D's Hip Hop Corner, one of the oldest and largest websites about hip-hop, and the co-author with me of the young adult edition of Can't Stop, Won't Stop, Davey D. And last but very much not least, Karen Good-Marable. A writer, editor, journalist, and teacher from Prairie View, Texas, whose bylines have appeared in The New Yorker, Oxford American, Essence, Rolling Stone, and NPR. She's been an editor at Vibe, at Honey, at Ebony, and is the author of a new book dropping just in 3 weeks, yeah? Yaya and the Sea. Karen Good-Marable. So let's get into this. Ethics in hip-hop journalism. We all have kind of talked a lot about ethics, I think, many of us in this room. Transparency, accuracy, editorial independence, fairness, right? These different types of ideas. I'm wondering if you can tell me what's a core ethic to you that you've held, and what brought you to that? You know, something that animates your journalistic practice. And any of you can start. But go ahead.
I can start. I mean, for me, it goes back to how I was raised. So I was raised in West Philadelphia in what people would call a cultural nationalist household. And so blackness, Africanness was always at the center of that raising. And to me, when I was a young person, hip-hop was the connective tissue between what I was learning in my home and then what I experienced in pop culture. And so as an ethic, and one that I held dear and still hold dear, is this idea of black expression and black freedom and the things, all the other things that are connected to that. But this idea that to be free, you also have to be critical, you have to be self-critical, you also have to be aware, and you have to do your work. And so it's just this, I wouldn't even sometimes call it a hip hop. It's like there were hip hop aesthetics attached to my work, but I mainly specialized in the political coverage. And so that was what was at the center for me. The music, all of it for me was through the lens of politics, and in particular black politics. And I think that that's something, again, that I've held throughout my work and my career.
So, you know, I was thinking about that question, and I've worked in a lot of different positions in magazines, right? So I've worked in research, and I've been an editor, and I've been a writer. And so truth and accuracy are huge, of course, to any journalist. And getting it right, depending on what depending on the story that you're trying to tell, but also, and this is tricky, it's kind of knowing where the line is. There's a line as a writer, and I think particularly, I mean, I don't think much has changed in this, but particularly then, that, you know, things could get salacious, it could get unnecessary. You know, understanding where to draw the line without sacrificing the truth and the story is, I think, very important.
For me, the ethics it spans a few realms. First, in agreement with Akiba, I kind of grew up with a political lens. So first and foremost, my ethics is I'm responsible for my audience / my community. That comes first above anything. And in order to do that, you have to take certain steps. So I made sure early on I own all the stuff that I participate in. If I wrote for a magazine, I own my copy. I've been in about 30, 40 documentaries. It's stated I get to keep my footage. And there's reasons for that, because there's brilliance that comes out of some of this. You don't want to get misquoted. You don't want to have things that you work hard to bring to the forefront be on somebody's shelf, and you don't want to have erasure or somebody else be given credit for things that you work long and hard for. And lastly, it's documented for the community. It's documented for my kids, our family, us as hip hop to have later down. And so there's a lot of things that I've kept, and that's part of, coming from a perspective of having ethics. Like, I'm going to speak truth to power, and then lastly, I'm going to give voice to the voiceless. That comes first and foremost to me. And oftentimes that voiceless community is our folks. And so I figure there are other people and institutions that have vested interest and have a lot of resources to demean us, to undermine us, and to make us look like crap. I don't need to join that fray, and so I'm going to be looking for the best of us, and I'm going to try to highlight the best of us. And I see myself as a journalist, but I'm unapologetic, a warrior for our people and our community. So I'm not trying to be middle of the road. I'm not that type of journalist. I'm definitely going to be fighting for us, and I'm going to be truthful. So that's my ethical guidance.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'd say my value system probably dovetails with like that of like my colleagues. Like truth telling, accountability is very important. I also just feel like with me, I'm just very intent on, I guess, like affirming the humanity and the artistry of like the people that I cover and that I talk about and I write about and critique. I just feel like historically, like hip hop and like black art in general has been like perceived by many as like something other than like expression of an oppressed people, and I feel like that dynamic is like more intense than ever with just a lot of people who are like within the hip hop media sphere or like cover hip hop or talk about hip hop or regard hip hop as something less than as like it's obviously like artistically entertainment, but in terms of like just like spectating some of the violence and some of like the negative dynamics within the culture as something to be like lampooned or treated as like a comic book or something, and it just really agitates me. So yeah, I just want my work to always just affirm the artistry of my subjects, affirm that like they deserve their artistic license. This is like artistic expression. This isn't something that should be used to like criminalize them or their plight or their whatever may happen to make them have them suffering or whatever isn't like entertainment. It's reflective of like political dynamics and things that we need to uproot. So yeah, that's where I come at with my work. That's where I come from with my work.
Thanks. What's really interesting about this particular panel and even the previous panel that we had before is it's already kind of pointing out the differences between sort of mainstream journalism and hip-hop journalism, right? All of you mentioned in some way, shape, or form a sense of responsibility, a sense of accountability, and a sense of trying to advance black culture, black people. And in the ethics of journalism classes, in sort of journalistic ethics manifestos that we might see from professional journalist organizations, usually the number one thing that they're trying to bang in your heads is fairness, right? Equanimity, like this side and then that side. Fair and balancedness, right? Which we all know is whatever. And hip-hop journalism never started like that. Hip-hop journalism started from very much from a point of view, grew out of black criticism, black arts, and that kind of thing. One of the things that came up right away when Mimi was talking this morning was the sense of protectiveness that many of us journalists in hip-hop have felt around the artists and the culture. So what I wanted to do is maybe just ask a little bit more, because we've all been there. We've all done it here on this stage for sure. We've all been in those interviews And Andre, you actually brought this out on Twitter, or the medium formerly known as Twitter, where you had asked people, you said cultural journalists, has there ever been a time when you withheld stuff or you suppressed things that you're hearing in your interview? What was the origin for that? What caused you to post that, and what were you trying to look for when you were posting that?
So that question, I was just thinking about several different things, but like where it came from in my experiences, I was speaking with an artist and I asked them about a specific artistic choice that had been controversial in the past. And like, to be clear, like this specific like choice had already been like divulged. They had already expressed it. So it wasn't like I was suppressing new information or anything. But I didn't even explicitly ask about that choice. I asked about like how they draw the line between like artistic license and like disrespect, and they kind of like meandered into explaining that specific artistic choice, and I could tell that they were like getting flustered and they were like really frustrated because the answer they gave was like really bad. And then I pushed back, and then it just continued. Like the answer was just bad in the sense that it just wasn't well thought out, and I could tell that they were like getting upset and defensive. And so eventually I was just like, you know what, just like literally forget it. Like I didn't even ask you about that. Like you brought it up and I don't know. And so then like a week later, I'll just say things happen in the world that made me realize like, if that answer had like been published, things might not have been good for that artist. So I was just thinking about that in terms of like the consequences of like my choices, what I choose to put in the piece, what I choose to think, what I choose to say, you know, isn't an integral part of the piece, doesn't add to the piece necessarily. And so I was thinking about that instance, and then there was another instance where a colleague was telling me about interviewing an artist, and it was actually the artist's last interview. They ended up dying, and they were telling me that the artist was saying like in the actual conversation, they were saying like really like egregious like street-oriented stuff, just like boasting and whatnot. And like they had, I guess, the discernment to like take that out of like the final piece. Like they didn't, I guess, want the consequences of those comments to be like on them in part. So I was also thinking about that, and just like there are probably other like less consequential moments where like over the course of a conversation you just realize maybe the negative implications of this being publicized isn't worth like the choice to run it, because it's like not integral to the actual story you're trying to tell. And again, I want to be clear that it's not ever something where it's like they say something that's like harmful or hurtful and you're like, oh well, I don't want them to know that you do that. Like it's not that kind of thing. But you know, there's just moments within the course of conversations.
Yeah.
I did, to your point, I feel like, and kind of how you introduced this question, one of the things I have thought about in terms of hip-hop journalism, particularly when I entered it, which was like second, third wave, is, yeah, we're in the unique position, or at least we were, where, you know, we were both, like you said, protective of the culture because of the world and the empire and racism, but we're also tasked to getting the story and getting the story right, and I think that's a fine line to walk. You know, I also remember being an editor at Vibe, and you know, record label execs would kick in the door waving the 4-4. And you would be like, okay, you know, like it became somewhat dangerous, you know? I know for me, I did have an instance where I was interviewing DMX, and I mean, just as a specific instance. I was interviewing DMX, and actually, I really like that story. If you can get past the first line, that's a good story, especially if
It's
you
an
get to the
amazing story.
end. You know, I'm just saying.
We're gonna actually offer it on the liner notes, on the website too.
Just get past the
You can
first
just-
line. I don't know what I was trying to do that first line, but
You're,
you know,
you're
if you
wrong
can get
about that,
past
Karen. It's amazing.
But in interviewing him, you know, that was the time where, you know, you were looking for color in a story, and you know, the publicist tried to put you like, okay, so you're gonna follow DMX, you know, you're gonna go to the radio station, and then, but you know, at the time, you know, I think he just put out 2 albums that year, and both of them were #1, and he was like at the height, and it was a crazy day. And I just remember at one moment, this is all of that aside, there was one moment where I was in the back of an SUV, and his girlfriend was up front with the driver, and his pit bull was like on my foot, and he was passed out on my shoulder because he was making his blood passion. And I was like, whoa, I don't even know if I'm getting paid enough for this. I was so scared that the dog was gonna look up and not know me, and anyway, but he was saying a lot of stuff while he was inebriated. And I thought, and my editor's out there too, I'm pretty sure this is a story that Rob Kenner edited. The great Rob Kenner back there. You know, all of there was a transcript. You could hear what he was saying, but I thought that some of it was inappropriate. He was talking about members of his family, and he was not holding back, but he was toe up. And I remember going to Rob and saying, you know, this is what he said, and I'm writing the story, and yeah, the girlfriend's gonna be in here. And when he came out the truck and did a toast and broke the Hennessy bottle over his pants, and he was in his underwear on the street, you know, that's going in, like it's all going in. When the 2 girls see him on 125, see him, and they start rhyming, and that's a beautiful moment, and they're talking about his mom, and it's, you know, that's in there. But I don't know if, and all the things that, the nut graph, the reason why we're here, the reason why we're doing the story, that's in there. But I don't know if we should put what he said about, you know, his mama in the story. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think that, and I'm not saying that because I'm afraid that I'm gonna get my ass kicked, even though hip hop journalists have that. I don't want to say unique. It's not unique to us, but you know, that was happening, but that's not the reason why. The reason why is because I felt like some responsibility to him as a person and not as an artist. I was like, okay, there's enough to say, good and bad, in this. So maybe here's the line. So that's kind of what I meant when I was talking about where's the line.
Can I just add something really quickly to that? I mean, this is actually on the topic of DMX. Once I was at a panel. I mean, I wasn't on the panel, I was in the audience, and someone asked a journalist who I won't name, who was one of few black journalists who was able to write for his particular outlet. A student asked him, what do you do to get rappers to talk to you? And he said, I get them drunk. And he laughed, and I was horrified. Like, I was horrified, because obviously playing on somebody's addiction, I suppose if you're interested in having an explosive story that everybody talks about, then that's a good idea. But, I mean, it sounds cliche, but this is a person, right? And so the last thing I'll say on this is, and actually Liz Mendez-Berry assigned this to me. It was one of the last interviews with Old Dirty Bastard. He had just gotten out of prison. He was still very much on psychiatric medication. And when I talked to him, he was having trouble focusing on our conversation. So like State Property 2 was playing, and there was like a sex scene, and he got really distracted by it. It was like his mouth was sort of open slack. And I asked him, what's a typical day like for you now? And he said, I wake up, fuck some bitches. Eat breakfast, fuck some bitches. Take a shower, fuck some bitches. It was like this refrain, right? So I'm sitting up there at cross purposes, right? For one, I'm a woman. For two, I'm a black woman. For three, I'm like, the way that you're acting right now, like you're really showing off for company right now. At the same time, I knew that he was struggling with mental illness. And so that story never ran because it ended up that he did a reality show that sort of preempted the story. But I had to really talk to myself about whether or not I was going to do that. And the answer for me would be no, I would not do that. As juicy as it might have been, right? And sort of funny and quirky as it might have seemed, it was also like taking advantage of somebody who was in mental distress. And I think that that's just the wrong thing to do.
I have a few things to say about that. I think the premise of the question is loaded in this regard. We often, as hip hop, and in particular with black folks, we get asked these questions about responsibility. And we get the albatross around our neck that we gotta be fair and we gotta show everything, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I've worked for Clear Channel in management for a good 12 years, KML, worked at Time Warner and all that. And I've seen behind the scenes that they have no problems in keeping stuff hidden. I worked with people who have literally choked our boss. That's not gonna be talked about on the air. We've had artists at our summer jam fight, domestic violence, all that, but since it's a transactional type of relationship, and many of us are in transactional relationships when we're talking about music, we can't talk about what just happened with this artist because that artist needs to do our concert for free, or we have an understanding with the label, and all these different things transpire. And so we're not gonna do it under the guise of being professional relationships being maintained. And so, you keep that to yourself because that's the climate and that's the vibe. And literally, in my case, it might have been the thing that you signed on to. Like, we're not gonna talk about professional secrets. There have been artists before people were coming out that you knew was like, okay, you just got on the air and you're the heartthrob for these women, but you're also arguing with your boyfriend on this thing. And as a professional courtesy, we're not gonna out you, even though that's salacious. So what has happened is that there's an ecosystem. It used to be in the music business, sex, drugs, and rock and roll was what kind of, drove things. But I often teach my classes Black death, Black criminality, Black dysfunction, Black mayhem, Black confusion. That becomes a thing that a lot of people want you to go out and get. Now, I'm not gonna put people on spot, but I've had colleagues that were fired because they refused to do the gossip thing. Like, I'm not gonna get on the air and start, telling stories about this, that, and the other. It's not the right thing to do. Well, we'll find somebody who can. And so that becomes an ethos now that we live by. So it's no longer about, okay, did E40, for example, let's talk about his business prowess. How did you open up 5 stores? What's the relationship with your sister who also has 5 stores? And how do you're an entrepreneurial family, right? You got people now that are in positions of influence that say, that's not interesting. We want to know if him and his brother had a fight. And let's put that out there under the guise of journalism. And then that gets picked up and it gets reflected by people who have big microphones, folks who are now even outside our community. TMZ would be a perfect example. It used to just be about Hollywood stuff. Now this stuff just about Black dysfunction of people we don't even know until it's introduced on those lenses. So I'll be goddamn if I'm gonna be a part of that. Absolutely not. And I'll run up on folks and check them if I can. And that's the one reason why I maintain, autonomy and being in a position to control what I can control. Because that's the game plan, is to make us all look fucked up at the end of the day. And I think that's just something that we have to be aware of. The second thing is that this is a business of relationships. And so with relationships, what I draw the line in is, what's the relationship I have in my community? When I walk outside, well, two things. One, if I'm your friend, then it gives me an advantage to know why you operate. So I'm friends with a lot of artists. But I also have to be very clear that if I'm in the room with you as a friend, you're allowed to have your off-colored moments, and that does not mean that I get to go and repeat that. That's very, very important. So people have come to me, hey, you're good friends with so-and-so. Can you tell me the reason why the group broke up? No, I'm not gonna do that. We'll give you lots of money. I've had those offers. I'm not gonna do that, because if they knew that I'm coming in as Davey D, the journalist, maybe they would just button up and put on their good face, right? But if I'm Davey D, the friend, then, goddamn, if you're gonna walk around with your drawers and take a crap on the carpet, that's not for me to report, because now we're friends and we gotta draw the line. And then people will gaslight you and say, well, that's part of the story. No, you got an hour's worth of information and you only have 20 minutes to fit it in. Why are you focusing on the off-colored moment versus the brilliant moment? And I don't apologize for that, and none of us should either. We should definitely draw the line. I draw the line. And to the point is, like, if you don't want to hire me, don't hire me. I have my own outlets and my own publications and my own platforms to speak truth to power. That's what I mean. We have to be in those positions so you're never under that sort of duress. Lastly, we do have to navigate the thought of threats, because then people have an expectation, right? So the rule of thumb for me is I pay for my own way most of the time, right? It's like, you got to read the situation just like I read my block. There might be the D-boy on the corner. I say, what's up to him? I say hello, keep it moving. I'm not hanging out and going in their car and kicking it with them, because I don't want to be in that situation. And I don't want to have an expectation because I was hanging out with you so much and I'm seeing things that I don't want to see. And then it becomes really tricky, because even if I don't report it, somebody else may find out. They're thinking that you should be on their team. Is that making sense what I'm saying? You stick around with folks and they're gonna have expectations of you. So you gotta maintain a certain amount of autonomy. So I've hung out with people. It's like, man, we got you. You wanna come on this trip? I'll pay for the trip. It's my money, I paid for it. I don't owe nobody nothing. You wanna go to this dinner? I'll pay for the dinner if you're that type of person. And I think for hip hop, we've always had to navigate that. And I think we continuously have to do that, even more so because of what I said, what the ethos is. Black criminality, black dysfunction, throwing black people under the bus, and hip hop by extension is very profitable. I think it's $1 billion a year business. So you gotta kind of draw that line. And lastly, I'll say, our colleagues in other spaces do some really jacked up stuff, and they're very protective of their folks. They're protective in the political arena. They're protective in the in commerce. I think we gave this one example. I'll give the example and I'll pass the mic. I had a show where I do hip hop and politics. So this is with Clear Channel, and we were doing a series on sweatshops. And I've had activists on, and they were going in. Well, just so happens Nike opens up a store in San Francisco. And I get called into the office, and they're like, hey, the president of Nike wants you to interview him, and here's a set of questions, and also, can you not do any more sweatshop shows? That's funny, but now you're making 6 figures, you have your boss who gave you a primetime radio show, and now your ethics can be compromised, right? And so I had to figure out how I was going to navigate that, and I expressed, my situation. It's like, well, look, they're putting X amount of money into these coffers. So we really can't afford to be messing up the business. We can't make them look bad. So figure out what you want to do. And, what I wound up doing was doing an interview, asking some of the questions, slipping my own things in, and we never played it. But you sure as hell went to my other station that I was allowed to do and talked about it and even told the story. Right? So I had to have an avenue out. But a lot of people aren't into that position. A lot of people don't have that luxury because they haven't planned things out. They don't have somebody say, Jeff, I can't tell the story, but can you tell the story? If you're going to do it that way. Because where I work in these corporations, they sure as hell will drop a dime on you to somebody else. And so, you know, it's about protecting the community, but also using common sense and understanding that journalism today in many arenas is about PR-ship. You know, I'm going to be a stenographer for these record labels and this institution and all that. And truth-telling takes a back seat in those arenas. So if we want to be truth-tellers, we better have avenues where we could tell the truth and know how to do the dance when sometimes they're asking you to compromise.
Appreciate that.
Can I just say something funny though? I remember, and this is really for the students because this can happen on such a low level learning. I remember when I was like, I just got to Vibe magazine, and you know, I had a office that was really the equivalent of Harry Potter's, you know, cupboard under the stairs, like his little. That's where literally that was my office. And I remember one time I was going to Fat Farm, and I'll make this real short. I was going to Fat Farm, and Russell was there, and he gave me, like, I was like, oh, this is cute, this is cute. Now mind, I'm fresh from 17 magazine. I don't know nothing. And, you know, I left Fat Farm with a whole bunch of merchandise for free, and I walked back into the office, and I remember my editor was like, what's that? And I was like, oh, I went to Fat Farm, and Russell just gave me all this stuff, and it was just amazing. Want to see the skirt? And she was like, that's no, this is bad. You should, like, this is, I mean, I'm sure you meant well. You did, he meant well. I'm just saying, you didn't know. You didn't know. So I took it all back. But I'm just saying, like, even something as simple as, you know, being a little 20-something-year-old not knowing nothing about nothing, and you could get yourself inadvertently in a situation where you now owe somebody something, but you don't even know you owed them. You just thought you got a cute skirt.
There's so many issues in there. I want to take out two of them. In what you all have just said here, I want to take out two of them, and I'm trying to figure out which one we want to go first with. But let's do this. Let's talk about this. So in a lot of ways, what you all have articulated is your personal ethic, right? Your personal set of ethics and what animates you. Dave, you mentioned too, though, they could just go on to somebody else, right? They could just find another writer, somebody who's up and coming, who needs the money, who can tell that story, and they did. And we kind of experienced this in large fashion, in sort of massive fashion, in 1994. This was mentioned by Bakari on the previous panel with the meltdown at The Source magazine, where there was literally a publisher who wanted to have his, I guess he was a co-publisher, but he wasn't named till afterwards, like to have his records be given 5 stars, and editorial was like, no, that's not how it gets done. We have a set of ethics, we move a certain kind of a way, and your record sucks, right? I'm gonna die now. But this is what happened, right? This is what happened, and it led to literally all of the staff that had started up Source 1.0, 1.5 leading to Source 2.0, and that's a whole other story. But this is sort of, in some ways, and I wrote about this in Kansas Woodstock, because it kind of started to represent these choices that we had to make. We're working, we think, on behalf of the community. And here is a split in which folks are going in a different type of direction. That leads me to this big question, which is pertaining to an issue that was very much suppressed in hip-hop journalism for decades. And you all here, and especially Elizabeth Mendez-Berry, was one of the few people who actually tried to push this issue to the forefront, which is sexual assault in hip-hop, and which we've only started to see a reckoning in the last 15 years. And so here's another loaded question. And the loaded question is, because of our proximity, our intimacy with hip-hop, our sense of protectiveness, did we miss a lot of the stuff that was happening that we needed to report at that particular time? And this is for the older folks, but Andre, I really want to hear your perspective on this as well, because you've come of age during this period in which a lot of this stuff is undone, right? A lot of times they say the folks of the next generation are left with the problems that the previous generation couldn't resolve, and this is one of those things that's come to light now. Difficult, loaded, sorry, we got to talk about it.
I mean, I can start. You know, I left hip-hop journalism. And I left hip-hop journalism because of the extreme sexual harassment that I was dealing with. The artists were buck wild. You know, I had an artist in a car put his hand on my thigh and then slide it up. His thumb was near my vagina. I had somebody actually did write about this. The artist Anthony Hamilton, who's not a rapper, but you know, he's hip hop, you know, in proximity, adjacent, you know, and I had this really kind of disturbing interaction with him toward the end of a long day that we had spent together, and he looked at me and he said, "You're built like a stallion," right? And at the time, I knew what sexual harassment was, and I knew that I had dealt with sexual harassment, but it's almost like you go outside of yourself when that happens to you. And so for me, this might sound like a cop-out, but I feel like the responsibility to expose that was on the people who were in a higher position of power. The expectation that women who are dealing with sexual harassment every day at work, now it's our time that we're gonna do an expose about somebody who not only can ruin our livelihood and berate us, but also can be violent with us, and to not have often coworkers to have your back. It's sort of like I think about white supremacy when people talk about how, you know, what can we do about white supremacy? And I'm like, obviously, people who participate and benefit from white supremacy have to be the people who dismantle white supremacy. We have to push them to do that, yes, but at the same token, this idea, and I think that oftentimes people are like, as a woman journalist, how come you didn't do ... And I'm like, that's really easy for you to ask. Like, that's easy for you to ask.
As a male.
As a male, yeah. Like, you weren't in the studio when everybody was smoking and a bunch of women were in there and it appeared as if somebody might be getting sexually assaulted. You were not there when I was walking down on campus and somebody threw juice on me or chased me down the street. So, you know, I don't know if I feel defensive about this question, but I just feel like the job of exposing sexual violence and, you know, just domestic violence and all of that, the people who hold the power have to be the ones that spearhead that. Because otherwise, you know, you're somebody who doesn't have, for me, a lot of times, enough power to make an impact. You just have enough power to totally ruin your career and oftentimes to threaten your life.
I really feel where Akiba's coming from, and this kind of goes back to what I was saying initially. The onus is, you know, in this case, I'm glad you spelled that out, it's a power dynamic. And sexual assaults at the station. But nobody's gonna say anything by the order of the boss, the corporate boss, and the boss above that boss, because we need this artist to go do Summer Jam, right? Let that sink in, because Summer Jam is gonna benefit this station to $30 million or whatever. So nobody's gonna say anything. So that means when you have grassroots efforts that come along, I remember when POTUS, who Sheena talked about, you know, did the Love Hurts thing, right? Well, that was an opportunity for a lot of people to jump and say, let's look at that. Or when Elizabeth did the article, that was an opportunity for a lot of openings to happen. And there was a whole lot of folks who had positions of power on the corporate level that was like, yeah, this is cool, but we're not gonna really go there. And to a certain degree, they don't go there now. They'll keep it just within like a hip hop thing. Like, you know, like you're the only one, it's only because of hip hop that somebody did what you did. And we're just gonna act like it don't happen in offices and on the stock market and in the halls of Congress and the halls of the Senate and in church pews and all these other places. where we should be rising up and then say, let's have a fundamental change. It's easy to point and say, this is low-hanging fruit, and then write it off to an out-of-control artist. And you being a hip-hop, journalist, and you should have did stuff, and not everybody else in this room. And so that's where I think the reckoning has to happen, and that's a hard line to cross, because executives are often beholden to other executives, right? So, I make 6 figures, you making 7 figures, and you're making 8 figures, and there's an ecosystem that just says, shut all this down, unless, again, is black criminality, black death, black dysfunction, black mayhem. Now we can go full throttle and look at this almost as a form of entertainment that we don't try to change. And that's something that I think we're at a point now, 50 years now, we're looking at this and go, this got to change, or now we got to start pointing out what executive shut that down, what executive greenlit your piece, what advertiser overlooked what you were dealing with and said, you know what, I'm still going to support that. That's where we got to start holding those folks accountable. And I'll close with this, because I've seen those very same people shut shit down on things that are a lot less. You said something about my family. I don't think that's going to fly, so we're not going to do that. I've seen people say, you're talking about the police. I know that the police are brutalizing, but they control this arena that we got to go do our free concert at, so we're not going to talk about the police. We're going to shut that down. So they can shut everything down except our own pain, our challenges, and our resistance. They'll shut down our resistance because our resistance usually connects to dot. But they'll try to isolate it, and that's something that we're going to have to deal with. I'll close with saying we got to be very clear as to what is minstrel culture, and I'm using minstrel in a derogatory sense, craziness that we do, dysfunctionality, versus black culture. And I think a lot of people put the two together and think, well, I'm just, people acting crazy, that's just what black folks do. And that's some bullshit. We got to stop that, and we got to call people out, and we got to hold the line if we're in positions to hold the line and say this shouldn't be flying. So that's my thoughts.
I will say to that, when you were telling your story, that reminded me of being in a meeting with the then CEO of Vibe, and we were trying to do that terrible Toni Braxton cover where she was naked. And that absolutely speaks to what you're saying. Like, let's just go for. I mean, we're all young. We're trying to sell magazines. It is a lot when you think about it from back then, but it's not excusable. But I remember being in a meeting, and I remember it was the publisher, and then it was the head of the label of LaFace, and it was me and the assistants. I actually wasn't the assistant. I was there as an editor. But I remember the label head saying, I remember the question being, will she do it? And I remember the label head saying, that bitch is gonna do whatever I tell her to do. And I remember, because the CEO knows me, and he looked at me like, don't just, and I was like, oh, okay, well, this is what it is. I was, okay, all right, now I'm clearer. I was clear, but now, then I'm sitting here, and, I know that y'all are the bosses, And I also think, I think about the times, how times affect ethics too, in a way. Aaliyah is a huge, she's a huge example of how maybe we could have done a better job in reporting that story. And I'm not saying that no one did, and I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that and I think that a lot of rights have obviously been wronged. You know, Dream Hampton did an amazing, like, you know, like she took it to the Baja. She made up for a lot of what we all missed back then. But I think about how, like, sometimes the times, and this is not an excuse, but like the times kind of dictate like, we're not paying attention. We're just sort of like, oh, that's weird. Oh, he's this age and she's that age, and isn't that strange? Or she's fast. Like, you start looking at her as a thing, you know, and I feel like I'm, you know, one of the stories that I wrote a piece, and I think I said something like, oh, I just regret it, but I wish that there could be a book of regrets, like, that we've all read. Anyway.
But you all are like 22 and 21.
Thank you.
And that's something that also has to be kept in mind, not to interrupt you, but you're 21, 22, you're literally coming of age, and you're innocent, quotation marks, in a business that has people that's been there for generations. Some of these people you're going up against are the ones that ripped off our grandfathers and our parents, and they know all the stuff that's there.
Right.
So to you, you're trying to fight the power, and the question is, what happened to their peers to fight this? Where were the 50 and 60-year-olds at that time? Where were them to check them? Because in the cases that I've seen, we're talking about, you know, folks that been there for 3-4 decades, and they can pull that card. Oh, this is how it's always been. It's better, you know. And you're like, man, I just got here.
Yeah.
Just got here. I don't want to really rock the boat. And now
Right.
you're figuring all this out.
You're learning how to be a thinker.
Yeah.
To your point, like, you're right. We were young. We were young.
We should be allowed that.
Yeah.
Not
That-
knowing.
That not knowing that, you know, I try to give myself grace for some of those things that I missed that were really just wrong. But she's one of them. Like, she's like, when I think about that coverage then, and like I said, it's not that people weren't thinking, but we weren't, like, it just was different. And yeah.
Andre, I want to hear what you are thinking about this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has been said. Yeah, I mean, I agree that this is, like, obviously not a hip-hop thing. This is, like, a social dynamic that reflects in all over the world, and especially, like, in the Western, you know, in the West. I think that I often say, like, I feel like people think things like certain dynamics exist, like, solely within the figurative house of hip hop, but honestly, like, the house of hip hop is on the corrupted land in the first place. So we have to, like, consider the environment, the entire environment. And I feel like in some ways to speak to the times, I mean, I was obviously, like, a kid back then, so I can't really speak to, like, how it really was. But I just think, like, now maybe my only thing is, like, I think social media might have a factor in maybe holding people to account more than maybe existed back then, in terms of just, like, being able to see the backlash in a way that maybe you didn't before, like, because everybody's on social media. The corporations that these figures, you know, align with, they see the backlash. Oh, why are you sponsoring this guy? Why are you, you know, et cetera. So there's that element too. I also just think, I mean, this is just, like, my assumption. I just feel like a lot of, like, journalists, or I don't know, I just think a lot of them probably knew, and just, like, I think it comes down to, like, purpose also, like getting back to why we're here, like, your ethics, like, what are you in this for? Like, is it about truth telling? Is it about accountability? Or is it about social climbing? So if it's about the latter, then you're gonna, like, look the other way, and until it gets to be too, you know, there's too much smoke to look the other way, basically. So there's, you know, those elements. And I also feel like, I mean, yeah, things are, like, a little different now, I guess, in a better direction, but there's still that dynamic that I think is even worse now, because editorial, like, the magazine, the print editorial media doesn't really have the power that it even used to, in terms of, like, the artists and the labels knew that, like, you had to go through that vessel for promotion. Now it's not really like that. Some artists don't need the traditional quote unquote media. So I say that to say, like, there may be publishers and people in power at these outlets who are like, okay, we need to like make nice with the artists that may still want to do a cover with us or still do a feature with us. So then again, you're looking the other way on things because you have even less leverage than you did years ago. So yeah, I mean, that's basically what I think about it.
Jeff,
Appreciate it.
one thing I think is important. While we're talking about these challenges, we also need to make sure that hip hop takes some credit for pushing that envelope. I'm gonna claim Tarana Burke. That's hip hop. We're gonna claim Elizabeth, Rosa Clemente, Donalisa Fisher, Mark Anthony Neal. A lot of people who have spoken truth to power to the point that it rose up, right? And oftentimes we're like, oh, these Hollywood actresses, they're the ones that did it. No, you amplified something that you all were pushing the envelope for a long time. So there, to our credit, have been these issues being addressed almost from day one, right? There's a lot of people that have addressed this from day one and kept pushing. Some of them, we know them, so some of us, we've been in conversations where we have been jammed up and been told, like, hey, it might be somebody like Tony, what's her last name? You know what I'm talking about. Freestyle Fellowship. Blackman, I remember we were on a panel and we were talking about Kool Herc, like 20 years ago, and she goes, what about Cindy? What about Cindy? And that narrative had to change right there because it was not only about somebody correcting, but it was also relationships. Nah, brother, we're going to talk about extending this conversation and then having that reflected. And I think we've learned from a lot of folks that are in this room, as I think was pointed out. And hopefully more of us take up that challenge and make it reflective. I know with our show, if we don't have a woman sitting on our panel as guests, there's hell to be paid with my colleagues, Anita and others, because now it's almost automatic. It ain't going to be all male voices. It's going to making sure that there are seats at the table. That's hip hop. That's hip hop correcting itself. That's hip hop looking out, saying things ain't right, and bringing about a better tomorrow. And we got to take some credit for that, not somebody else who's outside the room and they came in and somehow saved us. We saved ourselves. And by extension, we helped maybe elevate the conversation in the mainstream. So I thank all those folks that I named and unnamed who did the hard work and may not have gotten credit.
Want to thank our panel. Unfortunately, we won't have any more time to take questions. We wanted to do that. I know I could listen to all of y'all talk for another couple hours, just like we were listening to Sidney Madden, who did Louder Than Riot and was able to talk about the Kim Osorio piece and end with Tarana Burke. Had a panel last night, and we could have listened to that for another 2 hours. We'll have time to talk over lunch, continue the conversations this afternoon, but please give it up for our panel here: Akiba Solomon, Karen Good-Marable, Davey D, Andre G. Thank you so much.
Thank you to everybody on the panel.